Thank you so much for coming during Reading Week to this very special event. I'm Tina Badowski, and I'm Director of the Campbell Center for the Study of Animal Welfare, and it's my absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker of today, Professor David Fraser. David has influenced and inspired many of us applied ethologists and animal welfare scientists over the years, and his 43 years of teaching and research has done a great deal of influence. For the students in this group who are switch species or are concerned about switching species, okay, right? Professor Fraser did his bachelor's in psychology at University of Toronto, followed by a PhD in Glasgow, and then he spent a couple of years at University of Edinburgh. Working with pigs at the time, yes. Then he returned to Canada and worked with moose for the Ministry of Environment, I believe, right? Okay. And then after some time working with moose, he began working at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and worked with pigs again, and is very well known for his early work, very important work on the behavior of piglets and suckling behavior and sows and many aspects. But at that time, he was also extremely well known for his pig poetry, which was featured on CBC and other media outlets, and maybe we'll get to hear that. Okay. In 1997, Professor Fraser took on the chair of animal welfare at UBC and is the leader of the internationally recognized animal welfare program there. He is also known for his leadership in animal care policy for the World Health Organization, the OIE, FAO, and also has played a very significant role in the building of our system here in Canada with the National Farm Animal Care Council and our codes of practice process. Also, the PhD students in here, and all of our other students should be very familiar with this book, but mine is plenty dog-eared and has Post-its in it, which is always a good sign. It's a very good read, and it's core reading within our animal welfare program. For David's contribution to science, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada in 2005. And so, without any further ado, I would like to welcome David to talk to us about one welfare.
Thank you, Tina, for a very generous introduction, although it is now 47 years. And thank you all for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. It's a great pleasure to be back in Guelph. Years ago, when I was an associate graduate faculty member of population medicine, I used to come once a year from Ottawa to give my lecture to the first-year veterinary class. So I would travel here for about 7 hours, give a 1-hour lecture, and travel home 7 hours. And I never, ever felt that the time could have been better spent. So it's a pleasure to be back. The role, first of all, sound check, back row. How are we? Yes, good. Yes, Ken, all right. And video recorder, fine, good. All right. The role of the pig in English literature, page 31, the passage that inspired William Blake's most famous poem. Porker, porker, sound asleep on the farm's manure heap, what immortal code of dress condoned thy rank untidiness? From what nostril, from what lung, breathed thy love of filth and dung? By what finger wert thou bidden to thy place upon the midden? In what perfume vat in hell steeped the essence of thy smell? Did he, one step from cleanliness, still thy filthy pelage bless? When thy stench at last arose, and all heaven held its nose, did he choke his work to see? Did he who made the rose make thee? Porker, porker, sound asleep on the farm's manure heap, what immortal code of dress could stand thy rank untidiness? one of my goals is to record the crucial role played by pigs in inspiring other works of English literature, and no captive audience ever escapes without an example. But in this talk, I want to explore a different question of what do we mean by one welfare? So it's a term that people are starting to use to recognize that human welfare and animal welfare are closely related, and that both are closely connected to the integrity of the environment in which we all live. Exploring the concept leads us into a wide range of questions, such as the role of human mental health in animal welfare, behavioral rehabilitation of humans and animals, the need for coordinated action between animal welfare and conservation movements, and many others. So this will be a very, very wide-ranging talk. But maybe we should start with a little bit of background. The term one welfare is obviously derived from the older term one health, which the OIE defines as that human health and animal health are interdependent and bound to the health of the ecosystems in which they exist. Just in case this is not familiar for anyone here, let's just take an example of a One Health episode. Some of you may remember 1997-98. There was a mysterious outbreak of a disease in Malaysia that killed many, many pigs and over 100 people, many of them pig farm workers. The disease turned out to be Nipah virus, carried by fruit bats living in the Malaysian forest. They had probably carried Nipah virus since time immemorial without any ill effects. But then, in the 20 years leading up to the outbreak, deforestation had been happening in Malaysia and had reduced the amount of habitat for the bats. In 97-98, slash and burn agriculture combined with a very severe drought led to a horrendous season of forest fires, so severe that the country was blanketed in a dense cloud. This is it seen from satellite imagery. And this was so severe that it led to less fruit on the forest trees. The bats then moved into cultivated orchards, which they did not normally do, and bat droppings and partly eaten fruit then fell into pig enclosures beneath the trees, transmitting Nipah virus to the pigs and from the pigs to the humans. So here was a classic example of One Health where all of the elements are present. An environmental disturbance had an impact on a population of wild animals. They entered into new contact with human settlements, transmitting a disease, first of all, to domestic animals and from domestic animals to humans. We have used this concept in this sense for a long time, usually, not exclusively, but usually with a focus on communicable diseases. One welfare is now being used to recognize the other kinds of connections between the welfare of people and animals and the link to our common environment. But what exactly are these links? And let me suggest three basic categories. The first and really obvious one is that improving animal welfare often improves human welfare and vice versa. Just some examples from around the world. Of course, a vast number of animals in the world are used in transportation, often in quite poor conditions. This is the famous Professor N.S. Ramaswamy, who took up the cause of animals used for work purposes, urging people to make changes, specifically well-designed harnesses that don't cause injury to the animals, adequate nutrition for animals that are exerting a high level of energy output, more efficient carts so that their work isn't wasted in high levels of friction within the wheels and so on. And Ramaswamy claimed that each of these three things, if done properly, could more or less double the working force of the animals and therefore improve the livelihood of the people. We're all familiar with animal rescue, especially for dogs and cats. In India, of course, the cow is a sacred animal. Its slaughter is prohibited in most parts of the country. But when a cow stops producing milk, if people can't afford to keep her, they're often let go as strays. And many of these eke out a marginal, low welfare existence, sometimes eating garbage, sometimes ingesting enough plastic to develop not a hairball in the rumen, but a plastic ball in the rumen that can be fatal. Fortunately, India has a long tradition of animal goshalas, animal rescue centers, specializing in cattle. There are thousands of them in India, some containing over 1,000 animals, so you can imagine the enormous number of animals involved. The Animal Welfare Board of India has now started a Goshala modernization program using the animals to produce biogas from manure, vermicompost from a combination of manure and earthworms, using the animals for draft power, training local people in the use of draft power, and then with this enormous number of animals taking advantage of that to achieve genetic improvement of local breeds. So here's a case where solving a problem of animal welfare has led to multiple benefits for people as well. Here's an interesting example of animal and human rehabilitation. It involves a cooperative program between a prison and an animal shelter. Of course, many dogs are put down because of behavioral problems. Many of them can be rehabilitated, but it's a very time-consuming process, far too time-consuming in most cases for shelter workers. But in this case, the dogs are taken to a prison where specially selected inmates work closely with the dogs one-on-one to socialize them, train them, calm them down, get them to the point where instead of being euthanized, they can be released as dogs for adoption, in exceptional cases even becoming service animals for people with disabilities. Well, the welfare benefit for the dogs is obvious. It is also said to be highly beneficial for the prisoners, allowing them to develop a sense of responsibility, patience, tolerance, empathy, and achieve a sense of satisfaction through service to the animals. It's also said to be good for the prison guards because it creates a more positive interaction among the prisoners, and the wards where dog rehab is taking place are said to be the calmest, easiest parts of the prison to work in. And of course, the link between human welfare and animal welfare is very apparent in the case of animal production. 2008, a group of us met to advise the FAO on how to incorporate animal welfare into their activities, especially in the less economically developed countries, and led to this publication called Capacity Building to Implement Good Animal Welfare Practices, which is readily available online. Now, in economically poorer countries, we often hear the argument that animal welfare is a rich country preoccupation that simply competes with their priority of improving human welfare. So the meeting started by trying to identify and articulate the many ways that improving animal welfare is actually good for human welfare. As examples, good handling helps to improve growth and reproduction. Good nutrition improves production efficiency. Safe, comfortable environments prevents loss through injuries. Good loading and transport reduces losses through stress. And sanitation and hygiene, better for animal health and also for food safety. As just one example of that first point about animal handling, the field's very indebted to Paul Hemsworth and his colleagues. Paul shown here many years ago with his book, Human-Livestock Interactions. He and his colleagues have done many, many studies of how handling of animals influences their welfare and their productivity. Just as one example, they looked at 66 dairy farms and quantified the amount of negative handling of the cows on the farm. So this is the number of times that the handlers used slaps, hits, pushes, and tail twists in moving the animals. And the amount of negative handling correlated positively with avoidance of the handler in a standardized approach avoidance test, correlated positively with the amount of stress-related hormone cortisol in the milk, and correlated negatively with yearly milk yield in the herd. And from this and many other studies on different species, Paul and group have proposed a model that I have simplified down to this, that negative handling or inconsistent handling, which turns out to be just about as bad, sets up a chronic fear of people, leading to a classic stress response, including cortisol, etc., leading to reductions in growth, reproduction, and immune competence, and hence in health. Paul's group has also shown that this is partly about people having a positive attitude toward animals. So in one study, they used a questionnaire to divide animal handlers into those who described cattle in positive terms, like stimulating, entertaining, and intelligent. How many here think of cows as stimulating, entertaining, and intelligent? Yeah, good. Glad to see it. Versus those who described cows in negative terms, like noisy, smelly, and ugly. Any candidates? No, I thought not. And he showed that those who had this positive attitude toward animals handled them in more positive ways, and that set up that sequence of events leading to better outcomes. And as a result, they've added the emphasis on the selection and training of workers, training for handling skill, training to appreciate animals, and selecting workers who have a positive attitude toward animals as a way of intercepting this entire cycle and producing not only better productivity, but better animal welfare. And the working environment of farms affects the welfare of both the animals and the people. In a recent study, Rob Burton and colleagues looked at a sample of dairy farms in New Zealand, not unlike this one, and looked at how the physical layout of the farm led to either good or bad interaction between the staff and the animals. So the design of the milking parlor, the quality of the walkways, the corners, and so on, which could set up a situation where staff handled animals well and easily and positively, or the reverse. And they emphasized the key importance of designing systems and structures that promote positive interactions between animals and humans. We had a case of this a few years ago on a dairy farm in Canada that was using a rotary parlor for milking. But it was buying in cows, some of whom had not ever been on a rotary parlor in the course of their milking careers, and balked at getting on it. This led to a lot of physical force to get the cows onto the parlor, and it degenerated and created a culture where use of a lot of physical force became the norm, eventually ending up in criminal charges. I think the moral of the story is that we have these three elements: the animals, the people, and the environment. In that case, that environment combined with those animals and those people led to a negative culture of care, and we need to get all three elements right to create a positive culture of care. So to conclude, improving animal welfare often improves human welfare and vice versa. We see this in animal rescue, animal transportation, human and animal rehabilitation, of course in animal production. And I think some of the take-home messages in the case of animal production are: we want staff who enjoy animals, staff with the skill to handle animals, and environments that work well for both the staff and the animals. A second theme that I see in the One Welfare, under the One Welfare theme, is the need to coordinate actions between animal welfare and human welfare services. Of course, the need is well recognized in the case of violence. I'm sure we all are aware of the link between violence to animals, abuse of animals, and violence toward other people, often spouses and children. Social worker Professor Frank Ascione has been studying this link for many years. As just one example, here's a paper of his called Battered Pets and Domestic Violence, where they followed over 100 women escaping from violent partners and found women residing at domestic violence shelters were nearly 11 times more likely to report that their partner had hurt or killed pets than a comparison group of women who said they had not experienced intimate violence. And in some cases, the threat of harm to the animals was so severe that women delayed escaping from violent partners because of fears for the animals' safety. All right, so here what we see very clearly is the need for human social services, child services, and animal protection services to coordinate. The first person to see an abused child may be an animal protection officer acting on a call from neighbors. And if a domestic violence shelter doesn't partner with an animal shelter, women may not use their services. In the farm animals, I think the most severe, most common animal welfare problem is often neglect. And this has had far less research, but we're now realizing the link here with human health and mental health. One recent study in Denmark found that animal neglect is embedded in a complex network of other problems in agriculture, including severe financial difficulties, divorce, and psychiatric problems. The other recent study was done in Ireland. It looked at 13 cases of people accused of neglect of farm animals. It found that in 5 cases there was an underlying age or health-related difficulty. The person was mentally incompetent, had had a heart attack, for some reason couldn't continue to care for their animals, especially if an emergency arose. In 4 cases, there was a clear problem of depression or other situation of mental health. And in only 4 cases, the issue appeared to be that the farmer did not attach high priority to animal welfare, for example, by not calling in a veterinarian when one was obviously needed. Well, in these last 4 cases, maybe some training and sensitivity development might help, but in the great majority, clearly, in order to solve the problem of animal welfare, we need to solve the problem of human health and mental health. Hoarding. Well, for the companion animals, this is probably the most severe situation that we see because of the large number of animals and the length of time they may be in a very poor state of health and welfare. This has been studied for Gary Petronik and co-workers have studied hoarding through most of Gary's career. He characterizes hoarding as the situation where people accumulate many animals that overwhelm their ability to provide care, fail to acknowledge the deteriorating condition of the animals and the environment, and fail to recognize the harm to their own health and well-being. For a long time, it was thought that hoarding was a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. I think it is now recognized that hoarding, whether of animals or of objects, is its own distinct form of mental illness, but highly correlated with other forms. So in one study of object hoarding, people suffering from hoarding disorder had major depression in 57% of cases, social phobia, not going out, in 29%, generalized anxiety disorder, 28%, obsessive-compulsive disorder in 17%. I think the clear message here is that the animal welfare intervention in a case of hoarding has to be combined with a human mental health intervention, or we're likely to simply see the problem reoccur. We're starting now to see a little bit of attention to mental health in the farm population. This is, of course, hoarding tends to be, it can be either an urban or rural situation. Those neglect cases and some of the other problems are largely rural. Research in Quebec shows that the farm population has a higher rate of suicide and a much higher rate of work-related stress than the general population. The UPA, the Farmers Association in Quebec, has started an initiative to address mental health problems in the rural population. They are creating a mental health representative in each of their regions and recruiting 600 people to be mental health sentinels is the term they're using. These are people who often visit farms. They may be vets, hoof trimmers, feed salespersons, and so on. They receive 1 day of training, which does not make them mental health professionals, but does allow them to recognize the signs of mental health problems or incipient suicide and know how to make referrals. So we're starting to see a little bit of attention to human health and human mental health in the population of people that are handling animals. All right, we also see this link between human and animal welfare in the case of disaster relief. This is a photograph from Hurricane Katrina, where we see the reluctance of people to evacuate if they can't also assure the safety of their pets. This became a huge issue in Hurricane Katrina to the point that the US then instituted protocols for pet rescue in the case of disaster relief. And then elsewhere in the world, of course, many, many millions of small-scale livestock owners where the rescue of the animals in a disaster situation is the top priority because those animals are the livelihood for the family. This was taken after the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, and we see the family and its animals in a temporary shelter. And if the shelter is too small for everyone, it would generally be used for the animals and the people would do without. So I think so just to summarize, we see this need to coordinate action between animal welfare services and other services in the case of violence and animal abuse, animal neglect, hoarding, disaster relief, and I'm sure other situations as well. The third theme that I see in the One Welfare area is that protecting the environment is fundamental for both human and animal welfare. Classic example coming from is the introduction of invasive species into places where they can't be incorporated into a functioning ecological system. What country do we have here? Yeah. So in 1859, an English gentleman in Australia brought in 24 rabbits, saying the introduction of a few rabbits could do little harm and might provide a touch of home in addition to a spot of hunting. 1859. By 1880, the rabbits were in the millions. Toward the end of the century, it was clearly an ecological disaster, causing great hardship to people, but denuding the landscape to the point of driving native species to extinction. The result was that in 1901 began the construction of the rabbit-proof fence. Yeah? How long is it? 3,000 kilometers of fencing to keep rabbits out of the western, roughly quarter or third of the continent. Yeah? So what happened, of course, was a disaster for people and their livelihood. Also for the native animals who were being outcompeted for vegetation, etc. And, as you can see from the foreground of the picture, for the invasive species itself. Another issue, high-level issue we could point to is pollution. I grew up fairly close to Lake Erie. which is the world's 10th largest surface of fresh water. It had been in historic time a rich ecological system. Huge sturgeon coming out in the 17 and 1800s. Very vibrant fishery. By the time I saw the lake in the 1950s, it looked more like this, because essentially the green revolution, very green, had resulted in a lot of fertilizer application, fertilizer washing into the lake, along with municipal sewage and industrial effluent, and the pollution led to an enormous growth of algae, and then as the algae decompose, they use up the oxygen in the water, and everything suffocates. Yeah? The collapse of the ecological system of Lake Erie was of enormous impact on people, causing the collapse of the fisheries and people who depended on it, an aesthetic loss for everyone who lived nearby, and death through suffocation and starvation of a colossal number of animals. We're used to seeing this in a little farm pond, right? To see this happen in a water body the size of Lake Erie was mind-bending. Now it's happening in areas of ocean, being called coastal dead zones. Same process happening. One recent review proposed dead zones have now been reported in more than 400 systems, affecting a total area of more than 245,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of the United Kingdom, and causing mass mortality. And then just as one further example, let's think about climate change and the associated events like coastal flooding and extreme weather events affecting human and animal welfare on a grand scale. Trying to capture the likely effects of climate change on animals, biologist Chris Thomas and co-workers applied mid-range climate warming scenarios to a wide range of taxonomic groups in a wide range of selected areas in the world, and they concluded that we predict on the basis of mid-range climate warming scenarios for 2050 that 15 to 37% of species in our sample of regions and taxa will be committed to extinction. Now, even if this is only approximately correct, the impact of climate change on animals will be enormous. We normally think of extinction as a problem of conservation, not animal welfare, right? But can you really imagine driving so many species to extinction without also causing major impacts on their quality of life? Starvation, inability to raise young, and so on. In fact, two co-workers here in Canada wrote, the same human activities driving the current extinction crisis are also causing suffering, fear, physical injury, psychological trauma, and disease in wild animals. Now, we sometimes think of conservation and animal welfare as two quite distinct areas, different movements, one focused on individual animals and their quality of life, one focused on populations, ecological systems, and species. But I think what we see here is that the same challenges apply to both. And I would propose that in this century, as the human population has an increasing impact on the environment, that our threat to the life-sustaining processes and balances of nature it will be this century's major challenge to animal welfare and to conservation. All right, so what do we mean by one welfare? Well, as a concept, I think we can use it as a call to recognize the many interconnections between human welfare, animal welfare, and the integrity of the environment. And then in terms of practical action, I see the actions as to improve animal welfare in order to improve human welfare and vice versa, to coordinate actions between animal protection and other services, and to protect the life-sustaining processes of nature as a fundamental step for both human and animal welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? There's no class in here today, so unlike the usual situation, we're not under huge pressure to leave the premises. Who has a question for Professor Fraser? Derek.
Just in thinking about whether or not this this model is helpful for moving forward with discussions about animal welfare, most of us think, or many of us here think about welfare as having to do with sentience and feelings. And so does the parallel break down there when we talk about the environment in that triad, human, animal, environment? Does the environment have a welfare? I noticed you said integrity of the environment, not the welfare.
Oh, I see. Yeah. No. In the One Health concept, people sort of stretch the term health as if it applies to the environment. Well, World Health Organization definition of health applies to individuals, not to the environment. And so we tend to use a different form of words to say that human health and animal health are closely related and both depend on the integrity of the environment in which they live. Yeah? And I would use the same sort of language for animal welfare, for one welfare. Yeah?
Okay, so chickens are the animals that are most used by humans, and I was wondering how much overlap you think there is between the interests of humans and the interests of the chickens, their welfare.
Good. Okay. Well, let me.
To me, it seems like there's a major conflict because we think about like fast-growing breeds and problems associated with that, and fair housing and just the cost.
Okay. Well, all right. First of all, I would say the handling and husbandry thing should work the same as it does for other species. So good handling and husbandry would be good for the welfare of the birds and also enhance productivity. So at the most basic level, not having broken wings and condemned birds because of chicken catching crews, that kind of thing. So the Paul Hemsworth part of the story should certainly apply. Some of the food safety things could also apply. So having good control of bacteria for the sake of food safety as well as for the benefit of the birds. Poultry people, help me out here on some other examples. The barn environment, the high levels of ammonia are very unpleasant for the people involved, and of course are leading to frank health problems in addition to being aversive to the birds.
Actually, this is very much related to my question for you, because it has to do with animal welfare, the differences between a wealthy society and a not very wealthy society in terms of concerns for animal welfare. Mm-hmm. So the example that you gave, where the welfare of people and the welfare of animals rise together mm-hmm. in impoverished environments, but then you get to this level mm-hmm. where suddenly animal welfare is a rich man's problem because the situation changes. And I've seen this in attending the World Poultry Congress, because chickens are used everywhere. you see people from all over the world presenting papers and discussing, and there are many places in the world where they're just developing industrial practices for poultry production. And they're seeing huge advances in productivity, in reductions in disease, and benefits to humans. At those same meetings, we have Europeans or North Americans, mostly Europeans, raising their hands and saying, wait a minute, you're just putting them in cages. We just took them out of cages. So how do we resolve this human and animal once you reach a level of wealth?
Okay, but what do we mean by human welfare here? Do we simply mean the economic, the cost efficiency of the operation? Why does that translate into human welfare? So for example, we can push dairy cows to very high levels of production through feeding and genetics, but at the risk of increasing the incidence of metabolic disease, lameness, and so on. So we think there that, okay, if we say profit, then it's easy to find conflicts between animal welfare and profit. But why is profit a big deal? Why?
Because it's related to affordability. Some would argue.
Oh, no.
But in some places,
Folks.
so in some countries where they're developing ways to reduce, to increase profit. But I get you.
Okay.
That's where it's very difficult.
Okay. In certain fringes, yes. All right. I'll go along with you. Up to, in the countries of the world, except India, where meat consumption is less than about 20 kilograms per person per year, right? So up to about 20 or 25 kilograms per person per year, we see, except India, wonderful exception, we see improved health outcomes with increased meat consumption. Yeah? So that's up maybe 20, 25. World average is what? How many kilograms per person per year? This is Guelph! 42. Right? Maybe it's 44 this year. All right? At what point in red meat consumption do we start seeing evidence of health disbenefits? My reading is 65, maybe something like that. Yeah? So, and Canada and the US consumes how much per year? 120 for the US. You know, maybe double the level. We won't call it the toxic level, but double the level where you're starting to see human health disbenefits. So the argument about needing more animal protein to feed people, in my opinion, this is highly spurious, except in those unusual cases, some, for example, African countries, where there really is a poverty-related reduction in meat consumption. India is the wonderful exception. Per capita meat consumption in India, Krishna, tell me, no, 4 kilograms per person per year for cultural reasons. And show me the health disbenefits of that. No?
That's why I'm into eggs. That's why I'm
Oh, we cannot eggs.
Is that sort of along the line of the...
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay, thanks for the question. Very rich.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you think this model would apply to lab animals?
Good question. Good. PhD project for you. Figure this out. But let me give it one or two examples. Well, one example that I really like. Yeah. Joe Garner has done a couple of review articles recently on the translatability of animal model research for human behavioral and mental health problems. Do you know that literature? Yeah, okay. So We use an animal model, maybe a GM mouse model of some human ailment related to mental and behavioral, and take the resulting therapy and try it in humans for basic efficacy. I need an estimate of what percentage fail to show any effect for the intended human purpose. Thank you. 90% fail, right? So here's a case where we are deliberately creating a disease model that has very little efficacy in achieving the human health outcome that it's supposed to achieve. Contrast. You people will know this. I'm thinking of the work of Elizabeth Pluhar, doing stuff on brain cancers in dogs, treating the dog not as a model but as a patient. So these are millions of dogs coming into veterinary clinics with brain cancers. People treat the dog as a patient, not a model, try to cure the problem for the dog, and she claims, she and a group of others doing this type of work claim, high translatability of that kind of experimental intervention into successful human therapy. So one example, chapter 1 for your PhD thesis would be that we're using a lot of really crappy models that aren't good for human health and aren't good for the animals, and that in some cases, by trying to actually solve an animal health problem, we come up with insights that would be useful for human health. I'm sure there are many other examples of handling and appropriate environments for animals. Are we, for instance, okay. Chair, may I, one more?
Yes,
Yeah?
please.
Okay. Norbert Saxer's work with mouse models of Alzheimer's disease. Mice in little cages, very rapid onset of Alzheimer's-like symptoms, including plaque formation and so on. Then he puts them, same critters, into great big enriched cages. They go on and showing no symptoms for ages. Yeah? So are we making some fundamental mistakes in our knowledge about the disease development because we're putting animals in environments that are so totally unnatural for them that they may prove to be uninformative for the purposes of the work? Are we missing very important things because we're using a deprived animal model? 2 chapters. Hello, Renee.
When you suggest that child protection agencies and humane societies and social services work together, do you have any examples in mind? Is it done?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. For example, we had a meeting on this between BC and Yukon. Agencies working with women escaping from domestic violence. Complete recognition of the need to accommodate the animals in the situation. It's not by any means universal. I couldn't give you numbers on how common is it, but there are many examples of how the two work together. Either they partner with an animal shelter, or they have some provision for animals within the shelter. Yeah? Can you say that loudly?
Waterloo Humane Society's just started it, so Waterloo region, a few years ago.
Wonderful. Great to hear. Thank you.
Also, we've had cases where we've been very suspicious of the injury this patient has, told the Humane Society, and they've come and looked at it with us, and then extreme violence to these animals, and they've contacted the police to warn the woman of the household and actually charged the man with that. So there is, Humane Societies are very good at helping if the veterinarian reports.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. Yeah.
We do have coffee outside. I'll take one last question. We do have coffee outside and we have time for mingling and a meet and greet, but more hands are going up. What do we do?
And Sacratorte.
That's right.
We have a
That's right.
Bavarian or Swiss, should I say, delicacy? Austria. Oh,
But you know what? He's going to have to cut it into teeny tiny.
yeah, right.
Just a question. Very interesting talk, so thank you. One Health has been around for some time now, and so my question to you is, do you see in any time in the near future that One Health plus One Welfare are on the same level of priority in our society?
No, I don't. Well, it's hard at this point in the trajectory to see that happening. The One Welfare thing is so embryonic. Just a little bit of history of how this has unfolded just within Canada. This is 18. When did we have the meeting in Winnipeg? Was it 16? 2016? This started as a collaboration between the Chief Veterinary Officer and Chief Medical Officer in Manitoba, and they were interested in hoarding. And they referred to it as the Hoarding Conference. And a group of us, specifically the National Farm Animal Health and Welfare Council, they brought it to our group. And we kicked it around and said, you know, it's much bigger than just hoarding. And it developed into Canada's first One Welfare Conference. And that was 2 years ago. Yeah, coming up for 2 years ago. There will be a repeat in Australia either late this year or next year. So it's such an embryonic level. Whereas One Health is a big deal in veterinary education, World Organization for Animal Health, and so on. So I think there is so much muscle power in the health side of things that, and it's so unequal. There's so much muscle power in the health side of things compared to the welfare side of things. But let's wait and see. Yeah, we'll just have to see what the trajectory looks like. And it's very hard to predict, you know, from these very baby steps that are being taken.
One final question. The young lady next to Professor Kelly, and then we will.
Thank you so much for your talk. Just a follow-up on the fostering program for the domestic violence. There is a program in Guelph called Pet Protect Guelph that puts animals from situations of domestic violence or people care into foster families.
Okay.
That's just a really...
And does the woman, I'm going to assume, does the female partner who owns the pets, does she then maintain contact, or are they taken out of her control?
So, no, they are returned to the families once they're in a
Okay.
situation where they can.
Okay, and she knows that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
good.
So-
That's great.
And just another question. So I'm actually doing my PhD in geography, not with Evan. I do know him. But my third paper for my dissertation deals with this bridging of conservation and wildlife welfare.
Huh?
I'm interested in compassionate conservation.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if you could speak to maybe how can we reconcile the two? How can conservationists work towards improving the welfare of wildlife?
Okay.
Maybe through other models, or if you could speak to compassionate conservation.
Okay, good. For those who don't know the term compassionate conservation, this is almost as embryonic as One Welfare. Yeah? We actually had a meeting at UBC, my campus, in 2010, I think, 9 or 10. We brought together 15 people from the animal welfare side and 15 from the conservation side to map out what are the links between these two and how can they work better together. And in fact, there is a special issue of the journal Animal Welfare published in 2010 with that as the theme, and there's a paper on conservation and animal welfare in wildlife management, aquaculture, the tourism guy didn't write his, agriculture, pest management, and so on. So that was pretty embryonic. We weren't sexy enough to think of the term compassionate conservation. I had a more academic name for it. I took conservation and animal welfare science, which makes the nice acronym CAUSE that sounds like a crow, right? So I thought that was nice. I even gave a talk called Conservation and Animal Welfare Science, CAWS. We've got the acronym, now let's invent the field. Then the Born Free people came up with the term compassionate conservation, which had a lot more legs. And then Mark Beckhoff grabbed the term and published a book about it, as he always does. Anyway, so there's a bit of a buzz about that. And we held the last compassionate conservation meeting in UBC, no, the second last, then there was one in Sydney, Australia last year. We had about 120 people come to this, from around the world for the UBC one. So we were talking about quite an embryonic development. The UK has just created its Wildlife Welfare Committee, had its inaugural conference last year or two. Okay, when people talk about this, they tend to focus on the welfare implication of conservation measures. So if you have to trap bears and move them somewhere else, how do you do that humanely? How do you manage pest control in a way that has better welfare outcomes rather than worse welfare outcomes, that kind of thing. And to my mind, that is a small piece of the issue. The real issue is that the changes to the functioning of ecological systems are having a major impact on both conservation and on animal welfare. So, okay, even a little more history here. In the 17 and 1800s, what was the big issue of animal ethics? So that every animal protection organization created in the 1800s, almost all of them were called Societies for the Prevention of... that too, good point. But Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So why do we have this long, rambling name, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals? Because that was the focus. The idea was people were being cruel to animals. Cruel people are bad people. We're trying to improve the moral tone of society by getting rid of cruelty. Huh? This past century, I think what people saw was the institutionalized use of animals in science, in high throughput laboratories, sow stalls, chickens in cages, and so on. And the concern was that we are using animals in institutionalized ways that need to be regulated, because these are sort of industrial, and we regulate industries, don't we? So we should be regulating the industries that use animals. I think this current century, our impact, the human impact on the environment and ecological systems is going to be such profound importance that we have to expand our thinking again from cruelty to institutionalized use to our unintended and indirect effects on animals just through population numbers, the pervasive nature of our technology, the impact on the planet, and so on. That's a long, rambly answer to a question.
I think we should meet outside. We've got coffee and people have to fight over the chocolate. Other things, thank you. Please join me in thanking you.